Even if it's going to be a very small audience, we can probably just sit down.
That's true.
Rather than post up here. Better to have it.
That's true. Yeah, we can do that.
And we can always revert to
Are you? Maybe not yet. Let's see if the crowd develops.
Yes, if they see us sitting post up.
Right, well, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all who have joined us this morning for our presentation organized by Animal People, hosted by Faiths at COP15. We will be speaking to you on the case for cosmic concern, faith perspectives on the nexus of people, animals, and the environment. So to get started, I will go ahead and introduce the members of our panel. I am Wolf Gordon Clifton. I am the Executive Director of Animal People, which is an animal protection NGO that is active in international policy in areas including sustainability, sustainable development, and now biodiversity at the COP15. My own academic background is somewhat eclectic. I have a bachelor's in religious studies from Vanderbilt University, and I have 2 master's degrees. The first, an MA in museum studies from the University of Washington, and the second, a Master of Science in geological sciences with a graduate certificate in conservation biology from Ohio University. So my interests and my training span several very disparate fields, and I'm excited to bring them together somewhat in this presentation on the intersection of animal protection, faith, and the preservation of biodiversity. Our second speaker will be Purity Karuga, who is the Partnership and Development Director for the Africa Network for Animal Welfare, based in Nairobi, Kenya. Purity has also worked for Nature Kenya, Kenya Forestry Research Institute, GIZ, and the World Wildlife Fund. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife Management from Moi University and a graduate degree in Sustainable International Development from Brandeis University, and has also been awarded a certificate in International Environmental Lawmaking and Diplomacy by UN Environment. So her expertise spans multiple fields too, including animal welfare, conservation, forestry, and agriculture. Dr. Mark Jones is the head of policy for the Born Free Foundation. He is a veterinarian by training, having trained at Liverpool University and studied fields including fish health, disease control, and the rescue and rehabilitation of wildlife in South America and Asia. He has master's degrees in both aquatic and wild animal health. And he will be, Purity and Dr. Jones will be speaking on the relevance of animal welfare as it's been recognized and as we're seeking to get recognized in UN frameworks. Purity focusing on the Nexus resolution, which was passed by UN Environment, and Mark speaking on the relevance of animal welfare to the biodiversity framework currently being drafted. And then finally, we will be hearing from Dr. Janet Rumfeldt, who is a professor and chair of the Liberal Arts Department at Regis University. Dr. Rumfeldt earned her MA in Philosophy of Religion from Denver Seminary and her PhD in Religion, Ethics, and Philosophy from Florida State University. Her work includes study of comparative religious traditions, philosophy, trauma studies, and the environmental humanities, including especially our relationships with non-human animals. She is the board president of Africa Network for Animal Welfare USA, and has also founded Running Wild, an annual run that supports conservation and animal welfare activities in Africa. So she will be getting our discussion started with some exploration of specific concepts in religious traditions. So after the presentations, we will have hopefully an open conversation in which I will be asking questions, which the audience and the panelists alike are welcome to weigh in on, as well as ask questions of their own. I'm hoping to just have a good, thoughtful conversation together. All right, so to introduce the topic, I will go ahead and start us off. So obviously, the intersection of animal welfare, biodiversity, and religion is bringing together several seemingly very disparate fields. And my colleagues will address why animal welfare is a biodiversity and a policy issue. But I want to touch on why religion is relevant to both of these other topics. And to do that, I want to draw attention, first off, pragmatically, to the fact that religions hold an enormous amount of influence and power in the world today. 84% of the world's population currently identifies with a religious tradition, and this percentage is expected to increase in future decades. Religious organizations own approximately 8% of the world's land surface, 50% of all schools worldwide, and 10% of financial institutions. But on a deeper level, there is also a conceptual resonance between religious traditions and the field of policy. In that both have a normative aspect. Both of them seek to define what it means to seek the common good for people and the larger world, and put in place practices to achieve that. So I'm going to be going through some brief examples of conceptual resources that various religious traditions offer that relate to ecology, to human relationships with non-human animals and with the natural world. These are all very briefly summarized, so I recognize that they may be overly simplified. If you want to discuss any of these concepts or share from your own faith perspective in more depth later, I welcome that during the discussion. I've broken these down into three categories: worldviews, restraints, and observances. Worldviews concern how we conceptualize nature and our own place as humans within the cosmos. Restraints refer to the types of behaviors as well as attitudes that we should avoid, and practices to discipline those. And observances refers to what we should do, the kind of action that is virtuous and helpful and beneficial in the world. And the concept of restraints and observances is drawn from the Hindu traditions in the yogic principles of the yamas and the niyamas, the restraints and observances. So there are various worldviews that are promoted by different religious traditions, many of which emphasize the interconnection of all living beings and all natural phenomena. This is an example from the indigenous traditions, specifically the Algonquin traditional religion, which I chose to honor some of my own ancestors among the Algonquin tribes. The concept of Manitou refers to a cosmic life force that flows between the sky, the earth, and the waters, and manifests in the form of living as well as non-living beings, so that everything in the universe is permeated with this vital energy. So this is a very powerful philosophy of interconnection. Another idea that I find especially resonant is the concept of Leela, which literally means divine play in the Hindu traditions, and in some traditions, especially the tantric movements of Shakta and Trika Shaiva schools of thought, believes that the universe itself is a manifestation of this divine play, arising from the creativity of the Supreme Being who desires to interact with and experience the world through living beings. And there's the concept of dominion in the Abrahamic traditions, which is subject to multiple interpretations, some of which have historically been less positive with respect to nature and non-human beings. But there's also a very, it can be interpreted as a very powerful call to stewardship as well, that as God created the world and created humans in his image. So it's thought that as God rules over us justly and compassionately, so should we steward other beings with justice and compassion and care. Now on to restraints. Virtually all religions include practices that are aimed at conditioning and disciplining our desires and behaviors that can cause harm to others. These can include practices such as fasting, as well as dietary restrictions, or practices such as begging for food, as is done by the Theravada Buddhist monks in the image here. This is a very common practice that not only limits consumption, but also limits the tendency to overindulge or to consume without thinking about how our actions impact other living beings. With specific respect to animals, many traditions include teachings on the proper treatment of non-human beings. Animal welfare regulations can be found, for example, in the Torah, or Jewish Bible, as well as in the Quran and the Hadiths of the Islamic tradition, regarding how we treat working animals, wild animals, and domestic animals. In the dietary rules of kashrut and halal, for example, there are regulations on how animals should be treated before and during slaughter to minimize suffering and distress. And another very powerful concept is that of ahimsa, which literally means non-violence or harmlessness, and is common to all of the dharmic traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. Ahimsa is a very important virtue. In fact, in Jainism, it is considered the basis of all virtues. It is often a basis for practices such as ethical vegetarianism and other lifestyle choices that limit the harm we cause to others. It's also been an important source of inspiration in activism. It was an important influence for Gandhi's techniques of nonviolent resistance, for example, which in turn were inspired by the practices of the Vishnoi, who are famous for their practice of ahimsa, including vegetarianism, not even killing plants, in fact, only consuming or using plants that have already died on their own, raising orphaned animals, and even putting themselves on the line physically to defend with their lives forests and wildlife against the encroachments of industry. And finally, on to observances, outward-oriented actions. Again, from the Hindu traditions is the concept of seva, or service, which includes service to living beings. It's thought of that by seeking the well-being of other creatures, we are in fact worshiping the Supreme Being who is in all living things. And one specific practice that I'm a huge fan of that's common to many traditions is the cultivation, the protection, and the restoration of biodiverse areas. These are often referred to as sacred groves. They can be found in many indigenous religious traditions. This is an example here of a restoration of a Yoruba sacred grove in Nigeria. It can be found in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition of Christianity, in the preservation of church forests, in the Hindu traditions throughout South India especially. You have numerous sacred groves which are hotspots for biodiversity. And I've even been to a Confucian sacred grove, a cemetery forest in Chufu, China, where Confucius and his immediate descendants are interred. And bringing us to the present day, observances would also include activism, spiritual worldviews, concepts of nature as sacred are extremely important to many indigenous traditions and indigenous-led activist movements, such as the water protector movement, which started in the United States, led by Native American tribes. And activism would also include the work of the members of the faiths at the Faiths for at COP15 movement, the religious organizations present here engaging in the policy process and helping to push for the strongest framework we can get for the preservation of our living world. And during the discussion, all those present will be able to showcase your own efforts in greater detail. So with that, I will move on to purity. And let me just pull up your slides. Right. I don't know if it'll stretch way to you. We can change places. Okay, we are trying to figure out the technical. Okay, actually it would be better if it's out.
Yeah, it's actually quite long. We can just go to
Apologies, we had a brief technical disruption. Go ahead, Purity.
Okay, thanks so much, Wolf. I'm really delighted to be here today to just talk about the aspect of animal welfare, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable development, mostly focusing on the resolution that was adopted early this year at the United Nations Environment Assembly. And just to start us off, I need to define the concept animal welfare because we've had a lot about biodiversity conservation in this meeting. We've had a lot about sustainable development, but there's a gap, especially when it centers to animals. So I am going to define what that is. And according to the World Organization for Animal Health, animal welfare is defined as the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the condition in which it lives in or dies. So their guiding principles read by WOAH, and one of them is free to hunger, nutrition, and thirst. The other one is fear from fear and distress, fear from physical and thermal discomfort, fear from pain, injury, and disease, and free to express normal patterns of behavior. So with this, what we can say that animals are sentient beings in the sense that they feel pain, in the sense that they feel hungry, they have emotions, and when they get sick, of course when they are stressed they get sick, just like humans do. And when they are sick, then that means that even the diseases can be moved to humans. So I need to stress that the concept of animal welfare applies in the context of human and animal relations. For instance, if an animal is in its natural undisturbed state, we can see something that will look like compromising their freedoms. For instance, if you have an antelope that wants to be eaten by probably a lion, and it will be distressed, but in actual fact, that's how nature is. But what animal welfare dictates is that such situations should not be prevented, but rather dictates that humans should not create conditions that negate their aforementioned freedoms. So we have to allow nature to be, but as humans we should not. Of all infectious diseases that we get are zoonotic, and 75% of new emerging diseases are also zoonotic. By zoonotic, I mean diseases that are transferred from animals to humans. This is happening due to human-animal interactions. COVID-19 pandemic was a wake-up call to all humanity, since we realized that the way we handle animals have a big impact to human health, our social lives, and also to the economy. Land use has immensely led to biodiversity loss due to encroachment and conversion of biodiversity-rich areas to agricultural land, and most alarming livestock farming, which contributes to 14.5% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gases. We understand the negative impacts of climate change, which range from floods, droughts, variability of rainfall patterns, hence affecting agricultural production and food insecurity, among others, ultimately affecting our health and our economy. Further, factory agriculture causes pollution from livestock waste and pesticides, which is a key driver of biodiversity loss, especially in aquatic ecosystems. It was due to this understanding of this connection between animal welfare, environment, and sustainable development that led to the need to bring the discussion to the global policy level. In 2019, during a conference that was held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, titled the Third African Welfare Conference, the participants were concerned that animals had not actually been put in the global environmental agenda. Yet there's that strong link that we all see with animals, environment, and sustainable development. And the civil society organization joined efforts to lobby governments in order to have the resolution at the United Nations Environmental Assembly. So early this year, 2nd March 2022, during the 5th session of UNEA, member states adopted a resolution titled Animal Welfare, Environment, and Sustainable Development Nexus. So this is at the policy level. And the asks of the resolution to the Executive Director of UNEA is to produce a report showing that nexus between animal welfare, environment, and sustainable development in close collaboration with the Tripartite Alliance. Currently is now Quadripartite Alliance since UNEP has since joined, and the One Health high-level expert panel, and prepare the summary of findings for consideration by member states. And then the second ask was to submit the report for peer review by member states. And then the third ask is in partnership with the Alliance through the strengthened relationship of UNEP with the Alliance, including matters related to animal welfare and nexus with human health and environment through a One Health approach, which has been a key area of discussion in this conference. And then to report to the Environment Assembly at its session in February 2024 on the findings of the report. So basically that's about the resolution, trying to address it from a policy perspective, with the goal of promoting the well-being of animals, conserving biodiversity, and these are key to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So from a faith perspective, we are here because of looking at how we can address these issues through our faiths, either at the grassroots and also at the policy level. And looking at the Christianity perspective, I would argue that it's due to our moral conviction that we needed to do something for the creation of God according to the Christian perspective. So it's a moral, sort of a moral obligation to actually do something so that we can protect the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Purity, for your wonderful summary of the Nexus resolution process and why animal welfare is a sustainable development issue. Next, we will be having Dr. Mark Jones speak on why animal welfare is a biodiversity issue and why Born Free is present at the COP15.
Thanks very much, Wolf. Very, very pleased to be here this morning. Thank you for inviting me. As Wolf said, my name's Mark. I'm a vet. I'm from the UK, and I've got my sort of career path, if you like, has involved veterinary practice, something that you probably recognise as normal veterinary practice with dogs and cats, working with industry, livestock industries, and more recently working with wildlife rescue and rehabilitation in Latin America and Asia, where I've worked with a lot of animals that were victims of wildlife trade and trafficking, and that really got me interested in the whole wildlife trade issue and wildlife exploitation issue. And I've spent the last 15 years in the NGO sector working on wildlife protection, wildlife trade and trafficking, and with a very big focus on animal welfare. I've been with Born Free since 2014, where I'm currently head of policy and I head up a team of 9 people. Now, Born Free is a wildlife protection organisation. We run field conservation, animal rescue and care, education and policy programs. We're predominantly focused on keystone African species, big cats, elephants, great apes, rhinos and so on. And our field conservation programs are primarily located in Africa. We do also have some programs in Asia and Latin America. And we're always working closely with local communities. So we work on, for instance, human-wildlife conflict mitigation. We work to incentivize wildlife protection within communities. We work on the generation of sustainable and humane livelihoods and so on. We also run rescue centres, wildlife rescue centres in Ethiopia, South Africa and India, and we have connections with many others. Our policy work, which is kind of my bag within the organisation, is global in its nature. So we work a lot with the multilateral environmental agreements, CBD, that's why we're here at CBD, CITES, the Wildlife Trade Treaty, the Convention on Migratory Species, and many others. And we have interests in other areas of international and national legislation and policy relating to wildlife protection and animal welfare. Now, Born Free is not a faith-based organisation, and I'm not a person of faith, at least not in a conventional sense. However, we do have a very strong belief that we need to transform our relationship with wild animals, and the theme of improving animal welfare cuts across all of our work. But many of the communities we work with are, of course, strongly faith-oriented, and their belief systems determine their attitudes and motivations towards wildlife and animals. So in traditional African religious cultures, some of the communities we work with in Africa, animals and birds are commonly given prominence in spiritual, sacred health and identity matters, and in some cases animals are believed to be deities, and the loss of animals and animal populations inevitably means the loss of religious and cultural identity among those communities. Most African clan names are related to particular animals. Clan animals are to be protected and respected, and clan names can be species specific or include whole genuses or families of animals. And people won't harm their clan animal, and they also believe that the animal will not harm them, which can lead to difficulties sometimes. But spiritual beliefs towards wild animals in Africa and in many other parts of the world are deep-rooted and varied. And when people hold these beliefs, it's very difficult to convince them otherwise, which can be good, can, as Wolf has mentioned, can sometimes create difficulties from an animal welfare perspective. But as a wildlife organisation working with those communities, it's vital we understand those attitudes, we learn from them, and we work with them if we're going to make progress towards our goals of better protecting animals and their welfare. Just stepping back a bit and talking about the global crises that we face and what we're really all here talking about in these 2 weeks, I think we're beginning to understand that the crises facing our climate, our biodiversity and our health are all interlinked. You can't approach them or find solutions to them in isolation from each other. So, for example, protecting and restoring nature is really key if we're going to limit the impacts of climate change, because nature acts as a buffer to climate change by absorbing the greenhouse gases that are causing global warming and providing a natural carbon store, as well as buffering against extreme weather and its consequences. And here at the CBD, we're hearing a lot about nature-based solutions or ecosystem-focused approaches as key parts of our efforts to limit the impacts of climate change. And scientists are only just beginning now to measure, through work that's been done on great whales and elephants, just how important the role of wild animals is to maintaining healthy natural systems that can store carbon and reduce climate change impacts. If you look at the converse, limiting global warming is also vital if we're going to protect wildlife and nature, because as the world warms up and environments change, many animals and plants find it increasingly difficult to thrive in the habitats they're evolved to live in. And when they disappear or maybe move to other areas, this disrupts and eventually destroys ecosystem integrity and the services that ecosystems provide. And protecting nature and wildlife is also key to preventing future pandemics like COVID-19, since while most of the viruses that can cause future pandemics, as Purity has said, probably originate in wild animals, it's only when we disrupt and exploit those animals that we put the health of other animals and people at risk. So how does animal welfare fit into all of this? Well, we like to think of our wildlife protection work in terms of a concept called compassionate conservation. And this really teaches that animal welfare is a vital component for successful wildlife conservation and, by extension, ecosystem protection and restoration. Understanding animal personalities and needs and their individual roles within their societies and the wider ecosystem can improve and indeed can be vital to the success of conservation programs. And introducing welfare considerations into animal management practices can help reduce perceived conflict with people and in turn reduce the drive for lethal animal control while improving the overall effectiveness of conflict mitigation practices. As I've said, the importance of welfare is probably even more self-evident when it comes to pandemic prevention. The COVID pandemic, has magnified long-standing deficiencies in animal welfare standards, and in particular the poor management of captive wild animals. And the destruction of natural ecosystems and the trade-in and consumption of wildlife, whether legal or illegal, and whether animals are taken from the wild or bred in captivity, is one of the serious underlying risk factors for pathogen spillover and the potential for the emergence of pandemics. Crowding, stress and injury among wild animals in trade and the circumstances in which they're traded and handled provide a perfect environment for pathogens to proliferate, mutate and spread between species and to people along the trade chain. And we're going to be faced with more and potentially more virulent pandemics unless we take strong action to prevent the emergence and spread of future zoonotic diseases linked with wildlife trade and consumption. And this is all the more likely to be a problem as wildlife trade continues to expand exponentially. So we need to pay far more attention to animal welfare. I think there is some progress being made. Increasing recognition of the sentience of individual animals is good to see. In the UK, where I'm from, we had something called the Sentience Act passed through Parliament earlier this year. It's interesting that in the West we tend to talk as if the recognition of animal sentience is a new thing, like we invented the idea, but many faiths and communities have recognised the individuality, intelligence, social nature and cultural importance of individual animals for millennia. And there are, I'm sure, among us here, people with different backgrounds and beliefs, but I think we probably all see respecting and improving animal welfare as an ethical and moral imperative in recognition of the intrinsic values of individual animals, and I would very much count myself among them. However, getting policymakers to recognise the importance of animal welfare and incorporating welfare considerations within international and national legislation and policy, particularly in relation to the management of wild animals, is more of a challenge. One really useful mechanism that is gaining traction is the One Health framework, and Purity has mentioned this already. And this recognises the interconnectedness of the health of humans, domestic and wild animals, plants, and the wider environment, including ecosystems. And its incorporation into the global biodiversity framework, which we're hoping to see emerge from this meeting here at the CBD, is something we're really pushing hard for. The One Welfare framework, which promotes the recognition that animal welfare, the well-being of biodiversity and people and the environment are all connected to human well-being, is perhaps less well recognised and understood. But that's something that we're all also really strongly promoting. But again, we tend to think of these frameworks, where I come from, as being new, when the interconnectedness of the natural world and all the beings that occupy it, including us, has been recognised by many cultures and religions for many centuries. So, in conclusion, international organisations like ours and international processes like the one we're all witnessing here in Montreal need to learn from communities and faith-based organisations who have often had strong respect for animals and their welfare for a very long time. And I'd like to just end by repeating something that was said during discussions on One Health at the Canada Pavilion on Monday. One of the speakers said, incorporating human rights into wildlife protection and conservation agreements is likely to prove a strong enabler of improved wildlife protection and animal welfare. And by human rights, we mean the rights of all people from all communities and all faiths. And given the importance, as I've said, many faiths place on the need for a healthy relationship with animals and wildlife, I think that could prove to be a really important factor in trying to achieve our conservation and animal welfare ambitions. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mark Jones, for explaining why animal welfare interlinks so closely with biodiversity and why good biodiversity policy has to account for the well-being of animals. Our final presenter will be Dr. Janet Rumfeld, who will be bringing us back to the topic of religion and hopefully prompting a lively discussion to follow. Janet, could you pause a second? I think there's an audio problem. Well, is that as effective as having the speaker? Okay, are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, you can go ahead then.
Can you hear me okay?
Can you hear it? Oh, okay, that's better.
Okay. All right, so the context of my presentation is the larger discussion of the animal welfare, environment, sustainable Nexus resolution that was passed by UNEA, as was talked about so eloquently by Purity and also by Dr. Mark, so thank you for that. What we all know is that animals are in trouble. We've seen the IPBES report that identifies the 5 direct drivers of biodiversity loss. This is, of course, all connected to human behavior, and I would also suggest that human behavior is at the root of the problems with animal welfare. There is a long history of argumentation suggesting that what's called the anthropocentric point of view justifies the exploitation of nature. Rob Taylor notes that John Muir was the first to critique Christianity for identifying what he believes to be the sort of key to anthropocentrism, which is that nature is limited in terms of its usefulness to humans. 100 years later, Lynn White wrote an influential yet controversial essay arguing that Christianity's anthropocentrism was communicated through its teachings and was at the heart of the contemporary ecological crisis. For White, Christianity was, quote, the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. Writing as a Christian, he argued that the ecological crisis would not end until, quote, we find a new religion or rethink the old one. Muir and White are in alignment with many contemporary ethicists who argue that the roots of humanity's exploitive behavior stem from anthropocentrism, a set of beliefs about humanity's place and role in nature, and of the value of nature. And essentially, biocentrism and ecocentrism are offered as alternatives or correctives to anthropocentrism. So let me define these terms a little more precisely. So if we think about anthropocentrism, and pardon me for going through this, but I want to go through it because it lays the groundwork, right? Anthropocentrism essentially argues that human beings are unique from and superior to the rest of the world. They have power over the natural world. Only humans have inherent value. They are both moral agents and moral subjects, so they can act morally and they should be the object of moral consideration. And non-human animals and the environment have no inherent value. Their value is in relation to the usefulness of human beings. My definition of biocentrism comes from Paul Taylor. He suggested that humans are both moral agents and subjects. That is in alignment with anthropocentrism. But this is different. At minimum, all living organisms, plants and animals, have inherent value and are worthy of moral consideration. All moral organisms are moral subjects insofar as they can be, quote, harmed and benefited, and their teleological aims can thereby be thwarted or supported. Ecocentrism, my definition, comes from Gregory Masson. He notes that life on Earth is interdependent. We've heard that talked about today. And, quote, individual living things and certain ecological collectives, things like species, ecosystems, old growth forests, those have a moral standing or an inherent value. Ethical decision-making should focus on the health and well-being of ecological wholes rather than with that of individual plants and animals. So this next slide sums up those viewpoints sort of graphically. Human beings are at the top of anthropocentrism. Paul Taylor argues for an egalitarianism between human beings and non-human living organisms, and ecocentrism sees all of these things as interconnected. So what I want to do is think about what religious traditions teach about humanity's place and role in nature. Do they, through their narratives and teachings, help adherents abandon anthropocentrism in favor of biocentrism and ecocentrism? And what does it mean if they don't? I'll begin to answer these questions by examining teachings from Christianity, Judaism, and Buddhism, and I'll make a determination about their view of humanity's place and role in nature. I do want to issue a caveat. These are my interpretations. There are always intra-religious interpretations and different ways to interpret these things, and I'm not speaking for any particular religious tradition. The first religion I want to look at is Pope Francis and Catholicism, right? Many of you have probably read Laudato Si, which means praise be on care for our common home. I suggest that Pope Francis, and this is debated, but I suggest that Pope Francis doesn't actually overturn anthropocentrism in this document. I think what he does is he limits it, doesn't actually abandon it. In his discussion of the creation mythology, he retains the anthropocentric idea that humans are unique and therefore have dignity and they're made in God's image. They have dominion over creation, but importantly, he puts limits to that. Dominion doesn't authorize exploitation. This concept is akin to a gardener who tills and keeps the earth. The earth is a gift from God. Human beings do not own it. God is the author of creation. And so it's the purpose of human beings to protect the earth for future generations. Further, non-human living beings have an inherent value apart from their usefulness to humans. Now, Pope Francis does identify anthropocentrism as a part of the root system of our contemporary ecological crisis, but with an important caveat. He says it's a misguided anthropocentrism. So what's important to note about Laudato Si is that when Pope Francis talks about anthropocentrism, he almost always qualifies it with something like misguided or excessive, something like that. Here, he connects anthropocentrism to being misguided. It says it's misguided because it's connected to what he calls the technocratic paradigm, which views humanity as having the technology and the power to do what they want in nature. He says the antidote, of course, is to recognize that everything is connected. Just quickly, in sum, human beings are created in God's image, superior and unique, but that superiority is connected to our responsibilities. All creatures have value and worth, and we are to enter into a universal communion with all of creation. So I want to move quickly to Judaism. In traditional Judaism, there are two sources of revelation. There's an oral Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, a written Torah and an oral Torah. And that was thought to be given to Moses at Mount Sinai, but also transmitted orally and then later written down, and we now know it as the Talmud. Christianity and Judaism share the same creation mythology, though the origins are in fact Hebraic. So Jews also view God as the source of creation or traditional Judaism, and all of creation is good. Human beings beings are unique. They are made in the image of God, but this is often interpreted as functional in terms of a God-given authority to steward the earth, to protect the earth. They recognize that the earth was created by God, therefore doesn't belong to human beings, but they are to oversee it on God's behalf. What's interesting is that the Torah, both the written Torah and the oral Torah, create even more limits around human authority in prescribing laws of nature and animals. In 1837, an Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Hirsch, discussed the halacha. It means Jewish law, but it means the way to go or walk, and it's Jewish law is central to traditional Jewish life. And he discusses the written Torah, and then he discusses his interpretation of the oral Torah. And so here I want to highlight just a few examples of the protection of animals that he talks about. And I'm just going to talk about a couple because I don't want to run out of time. So in Deuteronomy 20:19 through 20, the ancient Hebrews are about to besiege a city, and they are told by God that they are not to cut down any tree which produces food. In the oral Torah, as interpreted by Hirsch, he says essentially that this becomes a general prohibition against wanton waste or destruction. So one may use the created world, but one should not destroy something if it retains its usefulness as a fruit tree would. So you shouldn't cut down a fruit tree for timber, right? And so you also shouldn't waste things that are still useful. Avarice can also be a form of wasting, and so that becomes a problem. So for Hirsch, this principle instructs Jews to regard things as God's property. Exodus 23:5 instructs Jews who see a donkey suffering under the weight of a heavy load to relieve the donkey of its burden. The oral Torah, as interpreted by Hirsch, says this is a duty to animals, which indicates that animals can be moral subjects. Allah also notes that even if it's on the Sabbath, this should be done. And so this, Hirsch notes, puts relieving animal suffering on a par with relieving human suffering insofar as breaking the prohibition of working on the Sabbath. The last two things I wanted to talk about are Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 5:14. All the animals in the household, if there's on the seventh year of rest, they are also required to rest with the rest of the household, and also on the seventh day of the Sabbath. So the seventh year and the seventh day. So essentially then, I think in Judaism, as in Christianity, you have a limited anthropocentrism, at least in traditional Judaism. You do find ecocentrism and other beliefs in more contemporary views. Last, I wanted to quickly talk about Buddhism. And here, I want to talk about the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Zen master. And I want to talk about his doctrine of interpenetration and discuss how it's aligned with ecocentrism. He argues that it's called the principle of interbeing, and he argues that all phenomena are interdependent, all life is impermanent, and we need a deep and universal ecology to protect the earth in our minds. So in sum, he often used the example of tea in a cup to demonstrate that this concept of interbeing. Nothing has a separate essence or existence. Everything is. One might think that the tea in the cup is a separate entity, but for the tea to be in your cup, there had to be clouds to point our palms reverently before the monarch butterfly and the magnolia tree. All of life is impermanent. Human beings are in what he refers to in other literature as a perpetual cycle of no birth and no death. The cycle of rising from the earth and returning to it. But because we come from the earth and come back to it, that implies an obligation to care for the earth. And he knows that we've killed many species and ecosystems, and that's something we should be mindful of. And last, of course, we have to protect our minds from the anxiety and violence produced by modern culture, and we also have to protect the earth. So in sum, I think that Nhat Hanh, the concept of interbeing, is aligned with ecocentrism. But this raises an interesting question, right? I don't think that religions have to completely reject anthropocentrism in order to promote animal welfare and to relieve animal suffering, and of course to protect the environment. I think we see in limited anthropocentrism in Judaism, in traditional Judaism, and in Catholicism that there's a path forward to partner with religious traditions. And of course, in Thich Nhat Hanh's ecocentrism, there's a clear alignment and a rejection of anthropocentric belief. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janet Rumfeld. That was fascinating. I really appreciate bringing it full circle. We started with some religious perspectives. We went through the policy relevance of animal welfare to sustainable development and biodiversity, and we've successfully brought it back. So your presentation actually inspired a question, which I'll use as our first discussion question. We have a fairly small crowd, so I think that we might have the panelists sit a little bit lower to have a bit more of a conversational feel, and hopefully you can see us. Janet, can you see us? Sort of?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I can.
Okay. You can see me. Let's figure out how to include you. Maybe a cushion. I'll just have you here. I'll just place you here. All right. Okay, so to start off our discussion, I just wanted to establish a couple rules. So I've chosen a set of questions, some of which could be seen as somewhat critical in nature, but none of them are intended to be in any way disparaging of religion, and especially no specific religious tradition. So it may be appropriate, depending how the conversation goes, to discuss situations of conflict or ideas or practices in religious traditions that may have a more complicated legacy. But if that's going to be the case, please limit criticisms to the specific issue at hand. Do not disparage any religious tradition or the people who practice it, or for that matter, people who do not practice a religious tradition. All right, so with that, I will pose a question to everyone. Not everyone has to answer, but anyone who has a point of view may, panelists or audience members. So Dr. Rumfeld spoke a lot about anthropocentrism, the view of humans being at the center, literally or figuratively, of the moral universe. So does developing a more enlightened relationship with nature and with non-human animals require decentering humans in our worldview, or is it possible to have a spiritual anthropocentrism that is compatible with, or that even contributes to that enlightened attitude? So I'm interested in any points of view anyone may have.
Thanks very much, Wolf. That's it's a fascinating question, and it's a kind of dilemma in many respects. I think I don't have an answer to the question per se, but here at CBD, if you look at the text of the CBD Convention, it's actually, it's the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's a very anthropocentric convention in the way that it's constructed. It's all about protecting the benefits of biodiversity to people, and that's a worldview that a lot of governments will adhere to. So whatever we think about the sort of the morality of anthropocentrism, or whether it would be useful to move away from that, it is the situation that we're faced with. So from a pragmatic perspective, and that's why I talked a little bit about human rights at the end of my presentation there. It's the kind of construct in which we're forced to work at the moment. But I think the discussions, and they are sort of increasing discussions around ecocentrism or other ways of looking at things, are very, very helpful. But in the here and now, it's the construct that we have to work within. So we have to try and figure out how to make progress. And using human rights issues and the rights of people to a healthy environment, for example, as was agreed by the UN General Assembly earlier this year, could be a useful way of moving things forward to some extent.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have a response or a perspective to share?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for an enlightening presentations. I just wanted to reflect on the question that was raised. I just think it would be very impossible to think of decentralizing humans' control over the nature, specifically concerning the animal welfare. I think it would be very important to focus on engaging the local community, women and the youth, in engaging them from the designing to the implementation aspects. And of course, we need to empower the community more to realize the animal welfare. And as raised earlier, it is important to just make compatible mechanism to put human beings at the center and then make them the owners to realize the animal welfare.
Anyone else?
Thank you. Let me just begin by appreciating the presenters. Those presentations were great and very enlightening. I think my view in response to the question, I consider the stewardship aspect that human beings have been given the responsibility, being at the center. They need to ensure that all creation is taken care of meaningfully, and the fact that their needs, as per the freedoms, animal freedoms that were mentioned in one of the presentations, that animals should enjoy freedom from hunger and from fear and distress, and to exercise normal behavior. They should have freedom from discomfort, and all that. So I think it is important that all animals, and of course the aspect of awareness, everybody, including children, at their most impressionable stage, they should be sensitized about animals, because when they grow up, they become responsible and better stewards, of nature and all life around them.
Anyone else?
Okay, thanks so much for that question. Also to Mark for your great presentation in German. So when it comes to that question, I hope you can hear me now. So when it comes to that question, I think I feel like, as Mark said, this focus of conserving the environment and nature for human benefit. And you remember during the COVID pandemic, it's like everyone was enclosed and somehow nature sort of replenished itself. And you could find animals walking on the beaches, on the roads, and somehow things started changing. And that tells you something, that it's something that we are not doing right. Disease target that by 30 that everyone is talking about. I know it's an ambitious target, and I understand there's some who want to increase it even to 50%. I don't know how that possible will be, but we just hope we have an ambitious goal which will actually implement. But the point here is, if we can just step back as human beings, because we always think that we are conserving for our own good. But there's also this aspect when, you have a healthy environment, people and everything else is healthy in a way. Your minds are clean, you just want to go out there and have peace with nature. But the aspect of us always wanting nature for our benefit, I think that's something we need to deconstruct. And sort of, as one of us said, that be stewards, but also allow nature to be. I think that's a very key point. And if we can use our religious faith more or less, because there was a good summary of what we, or rather many religions subscribe to, we allow the religion to sort of instill that sort of that thing in them to ensure that people believe that they conserve nature for it to be, not necessarily to get from it. That would be a great thing.
Just one of the points follow on from something that you said, which really struck me. Thank you, Purity. There's a lot of really important stuff there. But what I've found really striking, I'm an aging white European bearded man. We need less aging white European bearded men talking about these issues. We need youth, we need women's groups, we need indigenous groups. And what I've found quite inspiring here is the strength of the voice of the First Nations here in Canada. And I think there's a lot that we can, I know 10 years ago you wouldn't have seen that. There's been a process of reconciliation in Canada going on over recent years, which has really increased the strength of that voice, that Indigenous people's voice here in Canada and other parts of North America. And it would be wonderful to see that come through in other parts of the world as well, because so many of those people have so many good things to say about their concept of the relationship that they have with nature and animals and so forth, that I think we could all hugely benefit from.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'll just share my own thoughts on the issue of anthropocentrism, and then we'll move on to another question. So from a spiritual worldview, I've always been much more strongly drawn toward non-anthropocentric worldviews. The concepts from the Hindu traditions and the Buddhist traditions of all beings being essentially microcosms of the divine, and all beings being interconnected. The existence of one is intimately connected with others. I really like the concept of Leela, or divine play, that the universe arises from the creativity of the Supreme Being, but not for the sake of humans exclusively or any other purpose, but simply for the sake of existence itself. That said, though, I do think that there's a lot of potential to reconceptualize some of the more rigid old anthropocentrism that basically interprets dominion, for example, as a license to exploit other beings, quote unquote, beneath us with abandon, and to reconceptualize that as stewardship. In the Confucian tradition, there's an important modern scholar named Du Wei-Ming, who has spoken about the need to shift from anthropocentrism to anthropocosmism, since in Confucian cosmology it's thought of that the human being is a microcosm for the entire universe, for heaven, earth, and the myriad things. And so as the universe supports life, so too should humans support life, and to cultivate empathy, connection with others, and to nurture everything. And so we're the center of our own universe, so to speak, but that's an obligation, not a privilege. All right, so I'll move then maybe to a more pragmatic question. So what are ways then that animal welfare groups, environmental groups, and faith-based organizations and communities can collaborate? I welcome any Any sharing of experience, especially if this is something you have experiences with, including challenging ones, maybe situations where there isn't perfect harmony and there's potential to improve by learning from one another here and now. Yes, Fraser.
Thank you. Just to reflect on, we all came from different parts of the world. We all have different experiences and expertise. And I would say integrating different expertise and sectors to use multi-sectoral approach, community engagement, right-based approach could help us realize this. What I'm trying to say here is most of the time only intellectuals or member states or organizations that has the exposure and the opportunities are engaged in implementing any policies or any paper, like frameworks or systems. But do we engage the grassroots community? And I'll just speak from our perspective, our organization's perspective. We used to have different approach to implement projects and programs. But these projects first focused on only the systems and policies on the high levels. And then it couldn't succeed and we couldn't achieve a lot. So we tried to focus on the grassroots community and the community, the bodies that take the abundance number of the population. And when we started that, we became very successful and the programs became very sustainable and change started to be seen. So my point here is it is very important to include the community, the grassroots, who doesn't have the opportunity to learn or know. I mean, there are different conventions, different negotiations being done, but how many of us know about it? Like how many of the communities know about it? So it's up to civil society organizations to reach to the community, to empower the community, to let them know that this is going on for your sake, and you have to know about this, and we should design a mechanism for them to engage and inject and contribute in the implementation and the realization of whatever it is that we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any perspectives to share? Joss?
Thank you, Wolf, and thank you, Freda, and everybody else for their contributions so far. My perspective is that everyone has something to offer. Indeed, there should not be top-down, but bottom-up approaches that are implemented. We find that communities, particularly at the grassroots levels, they have solutions, even to do with animal welfare. You find that oftentimes they are ignored, but they know, and when they are engaged and involved, they would give those solutions. I recall a situation where an organization wanted to address the drought situation in a community, and they just went and looked for a place to dig a well. They dug a well, and they installed piped water, and and that was the solution that they had given to that community. But a year later, nobody had touched the water, and they were surprised. Why? And these people need water. When they consulted, the people told them, you should have asked us where we wanted this water, because we can't touch where we can't touch the water where you have done, where you dug the well, because in history it was a burial ground, for our forefathers and mothers. So basically, if these people had been consulted, they would have solutions. And the same way, we had a situation where there was, people were consuming bushmeat and trapping the animals, and that was a concern. And when we did a survey, we found that actually the people could have an alternative, and the problem was that many of them had not been given an opportunity for formal and informal education, particularly. And with this, that was the solution they needed to abandon bushmeat. So now we have an approach in that community that let's promote education, and formal and informal, for them. And that is a system that, because they are on board, we see that it will cause the animals to thrive as opposed for them now depending on bushmeat. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think one of the examples right now is this convention as it's going on. I can see lots of groups represented, like this faith-based, it's here. Lots of indigenous communities, quite a number of side events going on, lots of high-level meetings with international organizations, youths. I've seen lots of youth action in terms of them being on the table to contribute and just to say what they think on the issues, and youth are very active and they just want to push their agenda using technology and all that. And I hope the parties or the member states are listening to us, because at the end of the day, we are all of us, not just the government, but the people they serve are the ones who are interacting with this biodiversity and the environment in general. So I think this is a very good example, and I would urge organizers of such meetings to ensure that we always have all these voices brought on the table to discuss, and not just come here and have meetings and at times make noise through demonstrations, but also to listen to us even when they are drafting the text, so that they can hear what we are saying, because when we talk, we have a reason as to why we are saying what we are saying, because we are actually on the ground and we know the issues. So I would urge the organizers, the parties, to listen to all these groups, because they have a voice and they know why we are saying what we are doing. Thank you.
Would you like to share anything, Mark? You talked about Born Free's work with with communities that are heavily religious.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing, going back to what Yosfat said, really, it's not just about asking the communities; it's about empowering the communities to take their own initiatives. It's about having leadership within those communities, not something that's led from an office in London or an office in DC or wherever it is, but it's about, and I mentioned in my talk that changing people's beliefs is very difficult, and it's not very constructive. What we're maybe trying to do, we collectively are trying to do in terms of wildlife protection, is changing people's behaviour, and that's a different thing. And you mentioned the importance of education, you mentioned the importance of empowerment, you mentioned the importance of making sure that communities are represented and truly represented by the people who are negotiating these kinds of treaties. So I think all of those things are really important. But the thing that we've really learned is that it's not just a matter of consulting communities about what's going on in the area. It's about making sure that those communities are empowered, giving them the tools to take their own initiatives and move things forward. And that way, I think you bring people along with you, and the outcomes are much, much more successful.
Thank you, Mark. Does anyone else present want to share on the topic? Yes. One moment. Let me write it down. Yes, Janet.
Thank you, and thank you for all your wonderful ideas. My audio is not great. I can't, for some reason, the audio is kind of through a bit garbled. But in essence, I think there's plenty of room for partnerships, and I like what Mark said about, religious faith organizations or faith-based organizations have to take the initiative, and I think that's very important. But I think we're already seeing some of that. We've got the Pollinator Project, and there's just a lot of room to, I think, to do things on the sacred grounds, right? With creating pollinator bushes and community gardens and things like that, all of which will be environment in our learning experience. There are also rituals that I think can be rethought. I'm not Catholic, but in Catholicism, for example, there's a blessing, even in Anglicanism, there's a blessing of the beasts, right? So the blessing of the animals. So why not, if these organizations were partnering more with, indigenous communities and with NGOs and nonprofits, then they would be able to think with them about how some of these practices could be reconfigured to promote animal welfare, and I think that would be very helpful. I mentioned this very briefly at the end, but I think one.
Your laptop.
That could be. Let me. 1 second. I'll pull her up on my phone.
Should be okay now.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Hi, Janet? Hi, I think my computer died, but I have you on my phone.
Okay. Wrap it up quickly. I love each other. I religious traditions. I don't agree on some things. I think the conversation is important. And I also know there are some factory farming initiatives that are going on. And that's an issue where faith traditions can get involved in because there are health, animal welfare, and environmental consequences. And, Mark mentioned zoonotic diseases and things like that. So.
All right, thank you, and sorry for the technical difficulties. Joss has a point.
Maybe just before we conclude on this topic, that question, Wolf, I just want to appreciate, the wealth of information that has been brought to the table by each and every one. And just to emphasize that very key is involvement, constructive engagement of everyone, the youth, the women, the opinion leaders, governments, coming to the table. You find that they would really contribute. Each and everyone has something to offer, and particularly the governments. Many times they are ignored, but they have to be on the table so that they can take whatever is discussed and convert it into policy. So this to me is really key, and there are many examples where I've been privileged to engage governments and seen them take up initiatives that they would have otherwise not. So that's really that's the bottom line. Thank you.
Between all of these different sectors, but going back thousands of years, you've had practices such as the cultivation of sacred groves, which benefit biodiversity. You've had institutions like goshalas and pintrapols, which are animal sanctuaries and hospitals in the Dharmic traditions. And you have practices like food sharing, which is done by many Hindu organizations, including ISKCON, the Society for Krishna Consciousness, distributing plant-based meals, which can be an excellent way of addressing hunger as well as promoting diets that are more sustainable than ones that are heavily based on meat and animal agriculture, and are of course better for animals. We're coming to the end of our time, so I think of a couple good closing questions. But I'll choose. How do among those represented here, how do your own convictions, be they religious, spiritual, or simply ethical or philosophical, inform your own work and your own advocacy in spaces like this? Joss?
Okay, let me attempt this. I'm personally excited because I think it's what really I'm convicted from. Also, I think it's more of religion that we are talking about here because I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, and my conviction comes from Proverbs 12:10, which says that a righteous man is kind to his animal, and the mercies of the wicked is cruel. So that motivates me that God at creation had interests of animals that as human beings we should treat them right, with kindness, and I think that that is motivating to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joss. Anyone else?
Thanks very much. Yeah, just from as a person of no particular faith, but I've got an enormous, I hope I have an enormous respect for the natural world. I've got a huge interest in the natural world. I did veterinary medicine because I was interested in the welfare of animals. But the more I see and the more I learn about the natural world, the more I realise that there's an awful lot that we don't know and we don't understand, that humans don't really understand. And we're beginning to maybe get a glimpse into the complexity of the cultures and the societies that some animals live in, and we're beginning to realise that animals are much more complex socially and culturally than perhaps we're used to. And as I say, I'm sure there are many local communities and groups that have understood this for a long time, but certainly where I come from in the West, it's something that's only sort of relatively recently begin to be understood through works that's been done on great apes or whales or elephants, or some of the more obvious candidates maybe. And I think the more we delve into other species, the more we'll begin to understand that these are complex, thinking, sentient beings that can feel and that can, well, what was it somebody said, it's not the question isn't whether they can talk, whether they can communicate, it's whether they can suffer, and that they have this range, a far greater range of emotions and relationships between each other than we realise. And we treat them badly. If we treat them badly, then obviously that's going to be bad for them, the individuals concerned. It's going to be bad for their wider societies, because as we know as humans, if you take individuals out of groups, then that's going to have a ripple effect for the whole group and the wider society, and ultimately it's going to reflect back onto us. So that's kind of where I come from. I come from the idea that you should move away from an anthropocentric view and a view of dominion in terms of, as you said, exploitation, towards one of stewardship, and ultimately more towards one of a sort of ecocentric view. So I hope that sort of helps provide some kind of insight.
That's great. Purity?
Thanks so much. For me, I grew up in the central part of Kenya, just next to Aberdeen National Park, and it's a very green environment. And I remember when we were kids, we would see walk to the forest and see these elephants, these huge animals, and the elephants, and then there are the monkeys, and it was very beautiful. And of course, from my faith, I'm a Christian, and I remember my mom would always tell us that this God's creation, we need to take care of it. And at that time, there was not much of human-wildlife conflicts because the population was not that big, and of course the communities or the local communities living around that area had that sort of knowledge, and my community was more or less a Christian community, so there were these teachings about the creation in Genesis. God created all these animals, the plants, and He said it's good. So there's that aspect of being a good steward towards the environment, and actually that drove me to do an undergrad degree in wildlife management based on that experience when I was growing up, and my career path has been that all through, just having that connection and feeling that we need to take care of these God's creation. So basically that's me, and that's my conviction in what I do.
Wonderful. Anyone else?
Speakers, it's too hard to hear me.
You can go ahead.
Okay, so I've actually been very influenced by the three traditions I talked about today. And I guess everybody has their own portal into sort of sinking deeper into your humanity. And for me, it was Judaism and earthiness, and despite its, I think its tendency, at least in some strands, its tendency toward anthropocentrism, that's not the entire tradition. And I think that it definitely focuses on behavior and recognizing your humanity. I mean, I read an article a couple weeks ago on death rituals, and how death rituals are very much an indicator of this notion that you find in Judaism and Christianity of dust you are, to dust you will return, which you can read that as a statement about your earthiness, right? And I think also from Thich Nhat Hanh and others in the Buddhist tradition, I have been much more drawn to ecocentrism and thinking about my deep interconnection and interdependence with the rest of the world. And most recently, I've been reading an indigenous thinker here in the States, Robin Kimmerer, who is an indigenous person, and she's a botanist, and she's a poet. And she wrote a wonderful book called Biting Sweetgrass, and I'm learning so much from her about the environment and how she approaches the world. Always more to learn.
Thank you so much, Janet. I guess I'll just speak briefly. Personally, I've been influenced by many traditions. I like how you talked about sinking deeply into humanity, because that relates to an important concept from the Confucian traditions, or the Confucianism, in which the word for Ren, or the character for Ren, which is the highest virtue in Confucianism. It's the virtue of essentially connecting with others in a benevolent and compassionate way. It's actually modified from the word for human. So the idea is that to be fully human, we have to treat others in an ethical way. That's something that's very powerful for me. I'm also very motivated by the Mahayana Buddhist concept of the Bodhisattva ideal, of having compassion for all beings and dedicating one's own spiritual pursuits toward the uplifting of all beings, people, animals, and others out of suffering, as well as the optimism that someday all beings will be lifted out of suffering, that kind of a spiritual worldview that transcends the often very dark circumstances of advocacy for the planet in the 21st century. And then finally, the core message of the Bhagavad Gita, that we do our work but surrender the results to God, that ultimately we all have our own duty to play in the world, but we have to surrender the consequences. And yeah, that's powerful as well, to not get disheartened when sometimes we don't see the immediate results, because we don't know how our own actions will ripple across eternity. All right, I think that's time. If anyone has any final concluding thoughts. Otherwise, Joss?
Yeah, just an experience.
Okay. Okay, we'll finish on with an experience from Joss, and then that will be the conclusion of our event.
Yeah, I like sharing this because it's something that when we have an encounter with the natural beings, and in our case, the animals, they kind of are able to speak to us in a special way. I did one time rescue an animal from a wire snare, and this animal, Dick looked at me when I released it with eyes that I have no doubt that were saying thank you. Because instead of just running away, stopped and looked at me, and since then, you know, besides motivating me to be kind to animals and to treat all animals as sentient beings, I also, you know, give wherever possible, give people opportunities to have an encounter with animals. The young people, we send them to the bush to remove the snares. Anybody that I am able to interact with, you know, we give them opportunities to go into the wild and see the animals, because somehow the animals are able to talk. Thank you.
That's a perfect concluding thought, Joss. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's attended our presentation today. I hope for the chance to speak with all of you in the days to come as we continue to advocate for a strong biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Thank you.